My entrance into this conversation of Catholic social teaching comes from two directions. One is that we're a congregation with missionaries in about 65 countries around the world. So in the late 60s and the early 70s, I heard lots of terrible stories, mostly from folks coming from Latin America, about lending, about oppressive military regimes, about the abuse by corporations of their citizenry, and all of that compounded into then what later became the petrodollar crisis that then ended up into a whole series of lending by banks that was certainly not guided by much criteria in terms of whether it was adding or being constructive in terms of those particular societies. The second was very much the traditional academic study of Catholic social teaching, which I enjoyed a great deal, and which formed for me in my pastoral work in states like Vermont and in Florida and Puerto Rico, a conversation of what the church was doing in the marketplace and how it was engaging people's lives in those places. Perhaps the question of Dom Helder Camera at the Second Vatican Council was the one that framed much of those conversations. Church of Jesus Christ, what do you have to say to a world that is suffering and where there are millions who grow increasingly poor and who are excluded from access to livelihood, to health care, to education, to adequate housing? And so we know that birthed for us the document of Gaudium et Spes and the Church in the Modern World, and the pact of that group of bishops who pushed very hard to have that included in that conversation. 40 years on, it seems to me, and the great themes of Catholic social teaching have always been about church-state and church-society. The other great actor that has entered that space is the private sector. And the Holy Father, I think, tries to speak to that business, private sector, investor, corporate leader in a way that perhaps is bringing us to a conversation that it's a tripartite conversation, but he clearly wants and identifies for us that many stakeholders have a role in this. And I think going forward, he pushes and he invites and he cajoles and he perhaps sometimes offers pretty straightforward analysis of what he sees as a way of getting us to look at our reality. And I think he suggests to us clearly what I like to call a capitalism 2.0. According to Pope Francis or according to a number of other political leaders that I know in the United States. And I think it's about this. How do we form individuals and institutions in a capitalism 2.0 that will offer the kind of system and the kind of direction going forward into a sustainable future? And how do we all play a role in that? That government has a role, that individuals have a role, that institutions, civil society, communities, employees, customers, clients, there's a role in this conversation going forward, and particularly also, obviously, that of citizens. So I want to focus for the last few minutes on three, I think, basic examples that I hope will bring home some of what I'm trying to talk about. Making the business as well as the moral and ethical case for the inclusion of environmental, social, and governance criteria in the assessment of corporations is witnessing significant recognition and acceptance across many industries. This is the result of a combination of the advocacy, I would argue, of socially responsible investors, of faith-consistent investors, and of civil society, the engagement of local communities in addressing some of the abuses both of their public officials and their corporate citizens, and the responsiveness, I think, in some instances, of some very enlightened CEOs. Let me give a few examples. I think many in the faith-consistent investing community have provided great leadership in this area and in the socially responsible investment. The organization that I chair is a combination of institutional faith-based investors, pension funds, family foundations, and endowments, has been around for 45 years, engaging this conversation amongst themselves as a coalition, but with the corporate sector, and more with the public sector. And what are they doing of late? We've all gone down the road, as we've discussed in many forums, of the things we don't want to invest in, whether it's sectors or industries or companies, and we've honed that skill down to a pretty reliable, I think, process. But we've never really only wanted that. That, it seems to me, is what the prophetic dimension of what the Holy Father is talking about, and what the prophetic call of the Scripture is about. The goal really for the Christian is to be constructing the new world and to be inviting others to participate in that. And it seems to me that's what the Capitalism 2.0 invitation is about. So many of these investors today have moved beyond excluding sectors and industries or companies or geographic regions that they don't want to invest in, and they're looking for what should they be investing in. Where are the places that they can put their assets, invest their capital, feel good about it, and feel happy in the evening, and that they know where their money actually sleeps and what it's doing while they're sleeping. And so impact investing is perhaps the newest flavor in that reality, but it calls us to look at are there appropriate tools and vehicles and instruments where we can invest in sustainable agriculture, in clean technology, in microfinance, in microinsurance, and making accessible basic services like housing, education, healthcare to the millions that don't have access to that. And gratefully, many have put their minds to this and are delivering those kinds of opportunities and those kind of funds for those who are interested. It's still perhaps maybe in the infancy of 15, 18% of those who are pushing this forward, but I think they are part of those drivers who are beginning to do that in different regions of the world. And I'd be happy to share afterwards a number of the funds that our own OIP Trust is invested in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. More work than perhaps the traditional investment style that people have followed, but for us, a better alignment in terms of what we believe, what our mission is, and what we are trying to do in terms of make a positive contribution to society. I want to talk about my two other experiences briefly. My experiences with the mining sector over the last 4 years is also encouraging. At the request of some leading CEOs of major mining companies, a dialogue was initiated with the Vatican, with Lambeth Palace, and more recently in South Africa, Zambia, and Peru. These folks came looking for a conversation, a day of reflection, where they would come together to think about the future of mining. Where were they going to be 10, 15, 20 years down the road? They were tired of the criticism of the legacy issues that often are associated with the industry, either destruction of the environment, abuse of human rights abuses, particularly of indigenous in remote areas. So they were looking for a way forward. And so that conversation at the Vatican at the Lambeth Palace continues. And in a way to search for, is it possible that one can envision the exploitation of natural resources in whatever country it's happening, in whatever region it's happening, that it can be done in a way that's looking for a sustainable future, that the industries involved in that can be seen as development partners instead of intrusive invaders into people's space that will leave the condition of the area in much worse space later on than when they started. And I think that conversation, it's not going to move forward immediately in great accomplishments in the short term, but I think it's begun to really call forth a whole new direction with that particular industry. In the financial services sector, the major drivers of the near meltdown, we've all done that analysis, and we continue to do it. We're dealing at the moment in the United States with this recent disclosure by Wells Fargo that was continuing to open numerous accounts for people and other services within the bank that they didn't really want. And we've all had numerous commissions and numerous ways of looking at what happened, why did it happen, and I think generally the conclusions are mixed in terms of why. But going forward, on the positive side, I think many of these large institutions, whether as a result of the catastrophic crisis and the threat of greater government intervention, or the advocacy of their customers, clients, and civil society, they have looked at their mistakes, and I think are seriously beginning to look at how indeed do you take a sector or an industry that will begin to make some positive contributions going forward. We've worked with 5 of the major banks in the United States, asked them to prepare a document, their own length they could choose. I think they ended up being 75, 80 pages long, to look at the culture of the institution, look at what they learned from the crisis, look at what changes they were putting in place going forward in terms of trying to address some of the challenges that we face. And so I think they have great opportunity, it seems to me, and some of them are seriously taking that up. When you look at what we're facing with the Sustainable Development Goals, when you're looking at what the UN proposals that are out there, can these institutions re-look at what services and products they're offering to people so that indeed they're seen as constructive contributions to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that private investors will actually invest in. I think the indication is that people are looking for those opportunities. I think it's an opportunity for many of those institutions to be much more proactive in creating some of those funds and those mechanisms and offering them to their clients. Let me close with 2 quotes. One was from an op-ed in the Washington Post just at the beginning of this week. This was by Tom Wilson, who's the chairman and the chief executive officer of Allstate Corporation, an insurance company. Let's dismiss that part first, excuse me. The corporation of the next 100 years must take on societal problems. On their own, governments, social service, and charitable organizations simply do not have the capabilities and the resources to solve the problems of inadequate education, poverty, or public fiscal insolvency. And most people agree. In a recent survey, 87% of young Americans and said corporations should be more than just about making money. They should be encouraged and rewarded for stepping up to solve society's problems. This will require a change in mindset. Today, the corporate leaders are graded on stock price, not on the amount of their good services and of their good contributions to addressing society's issues. And so he goes on in that particular op-ed to suggest a number of ways in which corporations are going to be called to look at that. And I think there is another piece in the Post this week that said, I think 87 million Americans cannot reliably stand an overdraft of $400 at the end of the month. And I know I've read some of the data from here in the UK that looks at the same thing. So you look at the financial sector, going back there, which is where I spend a great deal of my time looking at. What are the kinds of institutions that we need to put in place that are going to serve the needs of that large segment of the population that are now excluded from the services that they need, can't rely on being able to even access their accounts on a monthly basis, even if it's only once or twice. So that we need indeed to begin to look at constructing those corporations and those institutions that I think Pope Francis is talking about. He wants to make sure that the excluded are included, and he's challenging us to create the institutions whereby that becomes more possible. Thanks.